Hi, I'm Emma Agnew and I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked with many young people who identify as being a gang member or who have had that label ascribed to them by others. And it's my work with these young people which has moved me to rethink how I view gangs and what the root causes of gangs might be. And much of the research to date that has tried to understand the risk factors that lead young people to join gangs has focused on their apparently callous and antisocial personality traits or the poor family management by their parents. But by focusing on these individual psychological or moral deficits of young people or their parents, we are discounting the role and responsibility of the state in regards to the existence of the gang phenomenon. So interventions are continually aimed at controlling problematic individuals, and the need for real social transformation is totally ignored. So while risk factor research has the good intentions of determining who should be targeted by early intervention, it can also create dangerous assumptions. Certain young people from certain backgrounds are more likely to become criminals in the future. So these young people are targeted by authorities without necessarily demonstrating any criminal behavior. And of course, this leads to surveillance, to stigma, and basically sets them up for receiving punishment first over support, even though they are probably already socially excluded. So let's flip this question on its head. Instead of considering what individual and family risk factors might be as the root causes of gang violence, let's ask, what structural violence has the government committed against vulnerable communities? Structural violence being a term that relates to political and social systems that create the context for poverty, inequality, racism to exist. It prevents certain social groups from achieving social mobility, from fulfilling their potential. And I guess despite being one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the UK also has amongst the highest rates of inequality. So perhaps the existence of gangs can be best explained by pathological social conditions as opposed to pathological individuals. And research shows that street violence happens in the context of chronic social isolation, of rejection from mainstream society. It is under deep oppression that communities become disintegrating and infighting occurs. So perhaps the decision, although it's often not a choice, to join a gang for young people is as a result of antisocial political structures, not necessarily antisocial people. But of course, it's easier to displace the responsibility from the government by focusing on these mad and bad young people by blaming them, I guess, for social breakdown. And the gang label itself has been used to peddle damaging, often racialized narratives about young people. And it's this misuse of the gang label by privileged groups that helps create a menace against which society can band together. In other words, gang members make a very convenient enemy of the state so that social injustice can remain unchallenged. We're too busy blaming the mad and bad young people that we don't even look at what the government's doing. And in my research, I'm interested in the ways in which we use language and how this can impact young people, and more specifically, the language used at the top, at the government level, in government policy, and how it filters down through every layer of society, impacting how gangs are written about in newspapers, to how teachers respond to certain young people from certain areas, to the police intervention, like stop and searches, right down to the fact that some people might cross the road if they see what looks like a gang member, as they've been told by society, is walking towards them. How does the language in the government link to the experiences on the street? I guess just imagine everywhere you go, people crossing the street because they think you're dangerous. And I guess it's the message that starts at the top that means you get considered as dangerous first rather than vulnerable. And the onslaught of these negative images and negative experiences for these young people has real material impact on their lived realities, because often these ideas are internalized and no doubt ultimately affect their self-esteem. So, for example, let's look at the 2011 Ending Gang and Youth Violence Policy. There is a section in this policy literally titled "The Life Stories That Lead to Murder," and it proceeds to tell the story of boy X, who was born onto one of the most deprived estates in London, to a single mother struggling with a drug problem. And as I said, it goes on to say how this boy commits murder, and painting a picture of a typical life story which results in, such action essentially criminalizes poverty and reduces this fictitious family to perpetrators from the outset, rather than victims of structural violence. And furthermore, it's the same policy that talks about racial discrimination as being real or perceived. The fact that the policy literally includes the word perceived totally undermines the very real experiences of racism that many young people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds face every day. And that's pretty worrying at government level to be using that language, when we know that young Black men living in deprived areas are more likely to face the triple force of unemployment, segregation, and marginalization. And in fact, I'm more interested in the non-material aspects of poverty as a psychologist. The powerlessness, the shame, the humiliation, the assault on your self-esteem, as I mentioned earlier, that is more important from a psychological perspective in considering where gangs come from. And I've personally seen how the narratives in society directly impact young people themselves. One of the young people I work with said to me, "I'm the wickedest thing that's out there." He spoke about getting onto buses and seeing people clutch their handbags, shift in their seat because they were frightened of him. And this meant he no longer used public transport because it made him feel so bad about himself. So we need to start with language. We need to change how we talk about and how we view these young people that are caught up in a cycle of poverty, which, yes, might be characterized by violence. But we need to rehumanize these young people in a way that recognizes their unrelenting resilience and creativity in the face of more adversity than most people face in a lifetime. They are surviving in the only way they can. Another young person said to me he couldn't bear to see his mother cry every time she opened the electricity bill, and that is why he did what he did. So reconsidering gang members in this way can broaden the narrow perspective on them as perpetrators, as instead at risk from structural violence, as opposed to being a risk to society. And of course, this would instead call for a political and societal level understanding as to where gangs come from, not just an individual one. And ultimately, this might result in interventions that are aimed at social justice as opposed to criminal justice.